Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all doing well and staying safe wherever you are. We're so glad you could join us this morning. We have a busy day and a busy month ahead at WITA with 4 more webinars planned in the next 2 weeks. This is actually our 19th webinar since March, and we're pleased to be in a virtual meeting place for the trade community at a time when we cannot meet in person. One of our favorite new traditions is to highlight some of the people you're here with, even if you can't see their faces, give you a sense of who you're in community with today, even if we can't see each other. Welcome today to Francois Baird with the Fair Play Movement, Sherman Katz with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, Casey Swanson of the Coalition of Service Industries, and former U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills, who will also be joining us with Mike Froman and Susan Schwab on July 16th to continue our discussion of the future of the WTO. Welcome to all of them and to all of you. This is our first webinar today. At 2 p.m., we're hosting a one-on-one interview with Congressman Rick Larsen, the co-chair of the bipartisan U.S.-China Working Group. And on Thursday, we have a very, special timely event looking at digital services taxes and the trade policy response of the U.S. government. If you're watching this on Zoom, after discussion with our panelists, you'll have an ability to ask questions using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Also, with almost over 100 people on this webinar, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. It's our plan, as we've mentioned before, to try to invite all the candidates to be Director General of the WTO to meet with the U.S. and global trade community at WITA and discuss their plans for the WTO at this critical time in the organization's history. Today, it's a distinct pleasure to welcome Ambassador Jesús Seade, Mexico's Undersecretary for North America and one-time ambassador to the GATT. Welcome, Ambassador Seade, who's coming to us today from Hong Kong. After Ambassador Seade has his remarks, we will have questions and answers with you. As I mentioned before, you should have received, those of you who registered on Zoom should have received an email this morning with their biographies and today's event program. So we won't get into a lengthy introduction of our speakers, but I'm delighted to welcome them all to the WITA webinar platform. Ambassador Seade will be joined by our partner in many of these events, Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and a great friend of WITA, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, the president of the National Foreign Trade Council and a former Deputy Director General of the WTO. Thank you, Rufus and Wendy, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us. Wendy, turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Ken, and thanks to Ambassador Seade and Rufus for joining us this morning. We are in the process of interviewing the candidates for the Director General of the WTO. Tomorrow will be the end of the 30-day window for potential candidates to submit their applications. So far, 5 countries have nominated candidates, including from Egypt, Mexico, Korea, Moldova, and Nigeria. But there may be others. We still have another day. Capitals could be watching to see who's in the pool, and maybe we'll see some other candidates deciding that they should enter as well. We certainly have heard some rumors about some other people contemplating putting their hat in the ring. So what happens next? Just yesterday, the General Counsel announced that it will have about 3 days of meetings starting next week to provide a forum for each candidate to basically make their case why they would be the best Director General, what qualifications they have, how they could bring their experience to the table, and also importantly, their vision for the WTO, an organization that, as we all know, is under considerable stress. In many ways today, I think our discussion can be a good warm-up exercise for the discussions next week in Geneva, and we couldn't have a better colleague than Rufus Yerxa to interview Ambassador Seade. And I understand they go way back to the days when Rufus was our ambassador to I guess the GATT then. And so Rufus, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, and thanks, Ken, and thanks to WITA for putting on this event. And Jesus, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with our WITA audience. I can't really think of any single person that has more well-rounded experience in the Bretton Woods system, and particularly on the trade side of that system than my good friend and former colleague, Jesús Seade. As you know, he's now the Undersecretary for North America at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, was the chief negotiator of the final USMCA deal. But of course, he has a long career. We do go back, Wendy, you're right. We were ambassadors together in 1989 to 1993. And I think, Jesus, we actually joined, you arrived there just a couple of months before I did. And I remember many, many long days and nights of working together on the system. Of course, he's also a predecessor of mine as Deputy Director General. I believe actually you may be the only one or one of the few who was Deputy Director General, both of the GATT and the WTO. And of course, also served as Chief Economist at the World Bank and Senior Official at the IMF, PhD economist from Oxford, which even we Cambridge graduates have to acknowledge is probably the second best university. But in all seriousness, you do have great credentials, great background, and I know you have a lot to discuss with us today. So let's get right to it. I think what I'd like to start with, Jesus, is if, if we were taking an 8-minute cab ride across town and you were trying to convince me that why you're seeking the position, why you would be the right choice for it, and what you see as some of the major challenges, I'd like to give you that sort of opening opportunity now before we go to questions.
Thank you, Rufus. It's a really great pleasure to be joining this audience, this very exclusive, club webinar, which I immediately accepted the moment I realized that you were on the panel, as well as Wendy, whom I know less, but I also know and respect. But with Rufus, we go a long way. I don't think I arrived 2 months before you, maybe a few days. That's the way I recall it. I had just arrived, and then you came, and it really felt good. A young Mexican ambassador arriving in that incredible pandemonium of a negotiation, and then suddenly the United States also feels a young person with whom I immediately clicked with a very fond, sincere friendship. Why do I want to do this job? Well, I really have to be honest about it. I could be beating about the bush and saying all the issues that need to be done, but the bottom line is that I feel passionately about it. I was sent to that job just as a job. I was an economist. I had been involved in more fiscal issues than trade issues, although I had done trade issues. But as a young economist, I have been involved in fiscal reform in my country and in other countries. I've been an advisor. And then suddenly my government calls me to do this negotiation. I took it as an interesting job. But I immediately could feel the importance it had. And I really developed a deep passion. And since then, in 4 years of incredibly difficult negotiation, a year and a half that I had, you may remember, that I quit as an ambassador to become deputy head of the GATT in the team that was called in to rescue the failing negotiations. So I have a history also as a facilitator. That's often missed. People think I was negotiator and then deputy head of the new organization. In between, I was a facilitator with the best boss I've had in my life. Well, second to President López Obrador, which was Peter Sutherland. Peter Sutherland was a fantastic man, and he really was responsible more than anybody else for the success of that exercise and the creation of WTO. So it was a time to learn and to develop this commitment. And then I was deputy head of the organization. I moved to other parts of the Bretton Woods world. I was in senior positions in the IMF, very senior position, managing crisis, always relating to trade from the fringes. I went to Hong Kong for an extended period as a vice president of a university, but I always chose to continue teaching. I always taught international trade, my own brand of international trade teaching, which is heavy in institutions and negotiations, and reading the history, reading about the best Secretary of State the United States has had, Cordell Hull in the 1930s with President Roosevelt, and the origins of the multilateral system. And so I really have developed a profound belief on the importance of all this. So having been a co-creator with you of this whole thing, I really feel bad the way it is going. It really worries me for the welfare of ourselves, the welfare of our countries in the future, and even the peace of the world, because you never know when things go wrong, and things are already pretty unpleasant quite often. So I feel passionate about it. I consider it to be an extremely important thing to do, and I believe I can contribute. I believe I can make a contribution. Why do I believe that? Well, I believe I have the depth of knowledge that you do require. You cannot really come from outside. You can come from outside. You can be a distinguished politician from some country and go into the WTO on the blue skies. If things are going well, you can really inject new dynamics and so on as a leader, as an efficient manager and a good leader. But with things the way they are, you really have to know the stuff. Not just what it says, because what it says, your legal assistant can translate to you as Director General. But where it comes from, what are the balances? Why does it say that? What was adjusted? Why is the United States frustrated now on the appellate body, for example? It has a history. It's not just behavior now vis-a-vis the texts and the agreements. It has a history where we come from. You need to know that. Otherwise, in the first discussion between a leading European negotiator and a leading American negotiator as competent as Ambassador Yerxa, the Director General will be lost and will be unable to contribute. So you do need that depth, but it's not enough to know the depth, to have the depth, to know the stuff and the history and the geography of the stuff. You need to be a person with a sufficient breadth of vision to have a vision. And that, in my case, I think I acquire. It can come from different sources, from the senior positions I've had. But mainly with emerging markets. And so I believe I can have the breadth of vision to understand the connection, not only trade, but trade where it lives. And the environment to trade is embedded in economics, business, and finance. And I have that kind of breadth. I have the network and the relation with business sectors, east and west, north and south, and with governments, east and west, north and south. So I believe I have the knowledge, I have the leadership as a successful negotiator, I have the pretty universal education in contacting people and so on. And I want to put it all in place to the best of my abilities in the service of a major, beautiful cause, which is to restore the balance and the dynamism of the WTO and the multilateral system. I would leave it at that for now.
Well, thank you, Jesus. That was really a very good introduction to your reasoning and the degree of passion that you bring to this. And I think you and I would both agree this really is a sort of an unprecedented degree of crisis and difficulty within the multilateral system. Can you hear me, Jesus?
Yes, yes.
Sorry. You know,
I'm trying to place you in the middle of the screen so that when I look at you, I'm not at an angle, but looking at the...
Okay, that's all right. I know you're looking at me. So,
It's a good trick.
So, you know, you and I were there, of course, during the Uruguay round when there was a certain degree of crisis, but there was also favorable winds blowing across the globe in favor of kind of market-oriented systems and greater international cooperation, the rule of law. We don't see that today. Obviously, we see a WTO which is suffering from several different problems, an appellate body that's in dysfunction, the lack of clear commitment on the part of the major players to take it forward. And then, of course, a number of bilateral and regional disputes outside the WTO that have impinged on WTO rules and disciplines. So I guess my first question to you is as you come into a job like that, what do you see as the major challenge in getting the major players and then the bulk of the membership moving in a common direction towards restoring confidence in the system?
Yes, Rufus, you're absolutely right. We have favorable winds. I would also include a deep and evident interest from the business sector. They wanted the Uruguay round. They wanted the creation of what we were doing then. The WTO, nobody knew it was going to be the WTO. We were reinforcing the GATT, but everybody wanted that. You may remember that the switch from reinforcing GATT to actually creating a new organization was a joint proposal, European Union, Mexico, to which Canada expressed a keen interest. It was added as well. But we did have the business sector, mostly the American business sector, an amazing dedication, and also politics. I remember having in my office congressmen and senators visiting my office, and businessmen coming and going constantly, and going to your house because you would have some kind of reception for business people visiting and so on. It was a constant. And that kind of stuff has not been repeated. I believe that was one error of judgment when our immediate successors launched the Doha round, because the Doha round was not being demanded by all those people the way the previous stage had been demanded. But against the positives that we had then, I believe this time we have the negatives on our side. The ghost of the bad things that are happening and that can happen. I believe that we are now getting too close for comfort to ideas of a real demise of the system. We even had a legal initiative in the United States recently to pull out of WTO, which was immediately killed by Speaker Pelosi, as I understand it. But we cannot exclude that worse things can happen. The animosity between the United States and China, in a way, is understandable. You will remember, Rufus, that the worst part to close the round, the Uruguay round, was not agriculture, despite the headlines, was not intellectual property, despite the headlines. It was anti-dumping. Now, anti-dumping was, to put it in simplistic terms, the United States and Europe against the Asian tigers, which were excessively competitive and creating problems. The Asian tigers were tiny compared to China now, and were very much kind of market-based compared to China now. So the chasm that existed was nothing compared to today. And that was bad enough to be the worst challenge. So it is natural that there should be such a big challenge now. But a challenge was created by God Almighty for us to address it and to solve it, because the alternative is worse. So against the alternative, which is real chaos in the international system, I am convinced that China, for one, will respond. China will want to see, well, what do we need to know? What do we need to do? Once the United States looks serious to meet China, that they want to engage, what do we have to do to put Humpty Dumpty WTO together again? And the same question will go to the United States and to the Europeans. And I believe there will be a response, and we can salvage the system and give it a new dynamic. But you're right, the favorable winds that we had are not there now. You have to.
Yes, you have to create them. And let me ask you about creating them, because obviously you can't ignore the dynamic among the big players. Of course, there are many other countries in the system that are important to making it work, but without the cooperation of the big players, nothing can happen. And so let me get to the question of particularly the US-China dynamic. And I realize that as Director General, or as a candidate for Director General, you need to parse your words carefully about all of this. But, you know, Bob Lighthizer has indicated that he has three main criteria on which he'll judge somebody. The first is a commitment to fundamental reform of the WTO system. I would assume that you would support a reasonable and sensible and balanced reform agenda. He also says it's someone who has to acknowledge that the current system doesn't adequately deal with China's economy and China's state trading practices. And thirdly, there can't be any even whiff of anti-Americanism on the part of the candidate. So, of course, China may have a different list of criteria, and I'm just wondering how you see your ability and your role as an honest broker, as a sort of a marriage counselor, in addition to being, you know, somebody who articulates a vision. How do you get the US and China to do business in the WTO? You're muted, Jesus. You're on mute.
Sorry, I muted because it's good practice, but then I forget. To start with the last point that you mentioned from Bob Lighthizer, you know Bob as well as I do. He's a terrific guy. There's nobody more honest than he is. He's a very honest person, but he's tough. He's a tough negotiator. So he says things such as, for example, his approach to mending the appellate body is typical Lighthizer, and I respect it, but we have to find solutions. On the question of the whiff of anti-Americanism, well, I'm happy to say that my favorite sport is baseball, and my favorite team is not a Mexican team. It is, I have to confess, it may be unpopular with your audience, but it's the Yankees, actually. And I have plenty of family in the United States, brother, nephews, families of nephews, and then my daughter, whom you know, when she was a little kid, she's now married and happily living in the United States with little kids. So I have family in the United States, and it's very much my second home. It may actually be my actual home after I retire from the WTO, and if you give me some position, Rufus, in the United States. But on the United States, China, there are two things. I mean, how do you handle China? One way to handle China is dispute settlement. And in fact, there have been at least 44, that's my last count, maybe more by now, 44 actions, panels initiated against China. And that's a good way to address questions. It's a proper, well, it's not the proper way, negotiations is the other one, but it's a very proper way to address problems, and it has worked. And we have to put together again the dispute settlement system and make it work better. I think the United States has raised points that nobody disputes. In fact, the points are almost innocent on dispute settlement because the United States has not challenged anything in the agreements. It has said that the agreements are not being respected because the appellate body is going beyond the narrow mandate, or the retirement is not being respected, or various things. But all of that is the application of the agreement. And I believe that one can resolve all that in an effective way to give the United States and everybody else assurances that the appellate body and the whole system will stick to the limits of what was negotiated. And if there's anything to be improved on that, well, let's negotiate it, but not just correct it from the appellate body. So the way to address China, one way, a major way, is through disputes. It has been done, and let's fix the dispute settlement system. At the same time, to go beyond that, there are initiatives that have been launched by the United States. There is the work on the way in the small group being led, or well, that consists of, now, strictly speaking, the European Union, Japan, and the United States on industrial subsidies. That's very interesting work. It is really for the United States to work it out with China, how to incorporate that, or whether it can be incorporated, or in the context of what broader cover of stuff to make it more attractive for China. But what I do believe is that China will be a tough negotiator. There will not be a pushover ever, but at the same time, they will not risk really bringing down the WTO. I think every country loves the WTO. The WTO is necessary, but if one country loves it more than most, it has to be China. China depends on the WTO. I tell you, I've been living there, I've worked with them. From a Chinese perspective, for the businessman in China, for the politician, medium-ranked politician, and for the top-ranked politicians, the most important thing China has done in the last 50 years, second to launching the path of reform with Deng Xiaoping in 1978, is joining WTO. So they will respond to that. So I think that the bilateral relationship will never disappear. There may be a phase 2, US-China, but at the same time, we need to start a constructive dialogue, US-China, and with the others. Of course, the issues on appellate body are not US-China. They are US-Europe. So there are complex issues in different directions. We have to address those, and that will be a very good start for amending of the system and the start of an updating of the system, because the United States is right. We have not had any meaningful negotiations in 26 years. 26 years ago, China was not part of the system. The WTO that was negotiated without China. So it makes every bit of sense to go back to some of the issues and update them in a balanced way, in a way that can work with both. But I'm sure that's absolutely possible.
Good. Jesus, before we bring back in Wendy and the rest of the audience, let's turn just for a moment to the role of Director General and how you see the role. You have seen a number of Directors General in the past. You worked closely, you saw Arthur Dunkel, you obviously worked very closely with Peter Sutherland, and you've seen the others operate. Obviously there's these two different roles. One is as somebody who can handle the very technical aspects of the negotiations and contribute to the ideas and to the vision and to the details, but there's also this more political role of convincing the major powers to work together, of being able to, and you saw obviously a lot of that at Peter Sutherland, who was masterful at pressuring politicians and engaging, on a kind of that broader political level. So I'd like you to speak a moment about why, not so much why you see yourself doing, but how you see that role. What's the balance between, being the spokesperson for the system, the initiator of ideas, and also the kind of marriage counselor, the good offices of the Director General, that sort of thing, and how you see that balance?
Well, absolutely central question, Rufus. Having been a member, having been an ambassador to the system, I am as jealous as anybody about the concept of that being a member-driven organization. I understand that absolutely well. I would never dream of trying to impose an idea on Senegal or Mauritius, let alone a major country. It is a member-driven organization. But nevertheless, I think it is a mistake to take that to the extreme of just facilitating the dialogue, being the administrator of a system. I would certainly never be thinking of doing that. I would not be interested in doing that. I would see myself as being a respectful, tactful, politically careful, but assertive leader, generating dialogue, exploring ideas, being part of the discussion and trying to think, how do I turn it around? I always developed an approach that I learned from our common friend, William Rossier. You remember William Rossier, the Swiss ambassador to our negotiations. Not exactly what I'm going to say, this is my own development, but he taught me what a good negotiator is, or he explained to me. And in my judgment, a successful negotiator is somebody who finds a way to put himself in the shoes of his counterpart, and who begins to bat for the counterpart, not as an act of treason, but as an act of finding a solution to the problem. If I solve the problem that you need in a way that is consistent with my priorities and my interests and my limits, then we have a deal. In other words, we have to form a team together. And in fact, this was very much the way we used to work. You may remember another colleague of ours, extremely attractive personality, Paul Tran, who constantly spoke of complicity, connivance, that there has to be a connivance between the negotiators. Connivance really meaning trust, meaning let's get into this together. If there are 164 members in the WTO, let's imagine we have a 165th member, which is the coalition of negotiators who got together to get to a solution that everybody can live with and benefit from. So that's the way that I see it. And that requires an active, respectful, but active Director General who can demand attention, who can demand serious responses. For example, appellate body, hey, United States, you have said many times that you don't like it, but you have not said, what do you want? There is this proposal here. You like it or what? And if not, why? I mean, that's certainly part of the role, I think, to elicit positions in a more constructive and explicit way on the way to resolutions and to advance.
Well, thank you, Jesus. It's very good. And I think it's a good point now to bring Wendy back in. Wendy, I see you've gone video live again. And so let me turn it over to you to ask a couple questions before Ken fields questions from the audience.
Wendy, reminder to turn your microphone back on.
Thanks, Rufus. Okay, I'd like to ask a question about developing country status. This has been an issue of key concern, not only the United States, but other countries. And I don't know, I think the count is almost 2/3 of WTO members self-declare themselves as developing countries, which then allows them not to make full commitments and to get certain exceptions from certain provisions of certain agreements. How serious do you think this problem is, and how would you go about trying to address it?
You have to unmute, Jesus.
Yeah, I really think, I really think we are looking at it the wrong way. Not you, but I mean, the discussion. The way I look at special and differential treatment is like a discount card that you go to Walmart and you get a discount. And if I go to Walmart, I don't get a discount. You do and I don't. So I will feel jealous. You get the special and differential discount, okay? And if the World Trade Organization were an international trade version of Walmart, it would be absolutely correct to have the discussion that is commonly heard. But the reality is that everything is negotiated there. Everything is negotiated. When you come to a negotiation, you do have plenty of opportunity to talk to individual parties one by one. So why don't we make it more of a practice to negotiate also those kinds of aspects? If we insist on reclassifying countries, if we insist that a particular country will no longer be a developing country, okay, maybe the right approach, but I tell you, it's going to take us about as much, if not longer, than the Doha round to come to results. It's an impossible issue. It's discussing theology. You're going to convince me of your religion and I have another one. I think the right way to go about it is along the lines of course, trade facilitation is easy because it's trade facilitation. It's not a hard negotiating subject, but along the lines of the trade facilitation agreement, where special definitive treatment comes in the shape of contributions by developing countries, what commitments you can take. It's a bottom-up approach that was also subject to negotiation. So maybe somebody was not doing enough and somebody came to say, hey, you could do more, and it happened. And my reading is that it happened fairly well. Now, this can be extrapolated to real negotiations. Maybe in real negotiations, you have to do more, but you can do more. You can actually negotiate. You can have peer pressure, not on the conceptual fact that Brazil is not a developing country, but just saying, I expect you to have the normal rules on this and that, whereas on this, maybe not. I think that's the way to go, not to discuss the who, but to discuss the what. What does it imply to have that label? I certainly would never dream of, or would never sustain the thought that countries like Mexico or Brazil should have the same flexibilities as El Salvador or Angola. No. But at the same time, there may be aspects in which they are super developed. It could be that the most successful bakery in the world is Mexican, Bimbo. I've been to convenience stores deep in the north of China in universities when I went to try to attract students and things, and to our programs in my university in Hong Kong. And in those Bimbo is flour. I would never imagine that it's appropriate to give such a sector, or the car industry maybe, or the auto parts industry, or the steel industry, or probably most of manufacturers in Mexico, maybe. I'm not judging and I'm not negotiating for Mexico, and I will never again, if I become Director General, use Mexico as an example. It's just that I am more familiar now. But if you look at traditional agriculture, Mexico is really backward. The production of corn, not modern agriculture. Modern agriculture, it's top class. Asparagus and berries and all that. But traditional agriculture or fisheries is another example. Fisheries is a delicate example. We're in the middle of a negotiation. But the fisheries industry of Ecuador, for example, is much more capital intensive, modern, powerful than the Mexican. Because it is multinational, the Mexican is basically domestic. So does it make sense to say Mexico has no special definitive treatment in that sector, but Ecuador has it? So I think going about it in a more pragmatic way is the right approach, and that's what I would try to advance, including negotiation. So going back to my Walmart example, it is as if the price you and I get in Walmart is negotiated. Well, if it is negotiated, what does it mean you're having a discount? They will adjust for the fact that you have a discount when they negotiate with you. So that's the way that I see it.
Wendy, any follow-up?
Now, spoken like a trade negotiator, but I do take your point that perhaps taking a more pragmatic view to this issue may be a route for addressing the problem. But I do think it is a serious problem that really kind of undermines the credibility of the WTO. I also now would just want to shift to the whole issue of plurilateral.
It looks like he's trying to jump in. Ambassador
No,
Seade?
I don't mean to say the opposite. It's a very important issue, but let's not approach it with formulas. Let's approach it through negotiation. Maybe create a tier of countries that are fully protected with S&D without any negotiation. Most African countries, maybe. Not South Africa, perhaps. Maybe not Northern Edge, I don't know. Most least developed countries, for example, and other countries, fully S&D as we know it now. But more advanced developing countries like Mexico or Brazil or others, then it can become an issue where you don't have a principle that nothing will be available, but at the same time, nothing will be automatic. It'll be a matter for negotiation. There'll be some consideration. I have said more than is prudent to say, but just a pragmatic approach. I'm just not saying that the issue is not delicate. It needs to be addressed, yes.
Turning then to the issue of plurilaterals, we haven't really touched on that, and plurilaterals have become such an important feature of WTO negotiations. I'd be curious, what is your view on plurilaterals? Some say that it undermines the multilateral trading system, that you need to be inclusive and everyone needs to be part of these agreements. Others say, well, no, they could be stepping stones to, to multilateralism. And frankly, they're the only, concrete way the WTO can move forward. That is a negotiation among like-minded countries that want to negotiate on specific topics. So what is your view on plurilaterals? And as a Director General, is this something you would encourage or discourage?
And while Ambassador Seade turns on his microphone, we had a question that came in as well as one of the leaders on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. Are there some lessons that you can learn from that experience that you would be able to bring with you to the WTO? Sorry, I hope that is augmenting Wendy's question as well about the role of plurilaterals.
Well, on plurilaterals, again, I try to take a pragmatic approach and also a historic approach. As a schoolboy, I hated history. I was much more into sciences and things. But as I grew older, it's really a fabulous subject. I mean, if I could have one wish, place me for one day in the dawn of time in Sumeria or something like that, in Babylon. Looking at the history of the multilateral trading system, I believe that the 1970s were a period of great achievement. The Tokyo round was fantastic. And that's when we created all the plurilaterals. They were discriminatory. They were horrible, having some rules and others not. But they were absolutely powerful path breakers in creating rules accepted by the major, most important relevant countries, or at least many of them, on major subjects like anti-dumping and subsidies and all the areas where we have the Tokyo codes, I think we call them, the plurilaterals. It was a great way to move forward. It was the only way to move forward. Then the great achievement of the Uruguay round that Rufus and his friends managed to pull off, the great achievement, again, was not agriculture or anti-dumping. I believe, Rufus, if you would agree, the great achievement was to move to a substantively common set of rules. Before that, we had the developing countries having complete license to do anything they wanted, and then agriculture outside the rules, and textiles, horrible state, no services, no trips. It was a creation of common rules, including the enlargement of the Tokyo codes to multilateral chapters. So that was a
Jesus.
achievement. But insisting on that achievement towards the future
Yeah.
would be completely shooting ourselves in the foot. Why? Well, because the Uruguay round was possible precisely because there were huge enticements for developing countries to liberalize textiles, to liberalize agriculture, for developing countries to create intellectual property commitments and services, and all the various things. Those were the enticements. So they came in. But with all that already in the pocket, decision-making has become incredibly difficult. You no longer can have a deal like the Blair House Agreement that Rufus was part of between the Europeans and the Americans, that basically unlocked the agriculture chapter in those negotiations between the Europeans and just the Americans. Unthinkable now. Unthinkable. Now you have to have the Chinese and the Indians and the Brazilians, because all of them have a fundamental interest in the new system. So the only way to move forward is to allow plurilaterals. And I think it's, again, like in the 70s, a good way to move forward. And we see it with the 3 big plurilaterals that they are moving forward, and I look forward to their success. Having said that, I would try to the maximum extent possible, without being religious about it, I would try to make it possible, and also to the extent possible to work on the basis of benefits being multilateralized, so given to everybody. It depends on the issue, but to the extent possible. But basically, the main thing is, if we don't allow the plurilaterals, then we're stuck. I think we need to allow them and then see how we multilateralize them. So step by step, 70s and 90s, one and one.
Very good. Rufus, it looks like you were looking to jump in.
Oh, no, just, I know you want to go to questions now, and I support that. Just one comment on what Jesus said about the important part of the single undertaking and the common set of rules that the WTO created. I mean, one thing people need is a sense of history about all this. Is something you'll never hear Bob Lighthizer talk about, is the fact that there was far more special and differential treatment for developing countries before the Uruguay round in the WTO than there is after. We still need to make progress, but people need a sense of, where the path of progress has been in the past. But I know you want to open it up to questions, Ken.
So-
I think
so,
this is our time to do that.
We don't have a whole lot of time, but maybe Ambassador Seade, if we can move quickly through a couple of them. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that came in right now. One kind of plays off this. We've been discussing trade with in the developing countries and special and differential treatment. There's an issue that's been addressed. Former WTO Deputy Director Chul-Soo Kim launched with Bruce Aitken a trade negotiating training center to help address the so-called trade negotiating capacity gap between developed countries and some developing countries. I mean, the people we have on this session, Rufus and Wendy and yourself, are some of the most talented trade negotiators in the world. But not all countries have the capacity to be able to have delegations like yours to Geneva and trade ministries. What can we do, and what should the WTO be doing to address that trade negotiating gap, so that if we do negotiate what this special and differential were to be, that they have the capacity to be able to achieve some of the best outcomes for their countries?
You're right, or the person asking the question is absolutely right. There is a fundamental disadvantage developing countries have, or small countries have, which is not the same as developing countries. And small developing countries have even more. And small island economies are absolutely basically prevented from joining the system. So I already mentioned the anecdote, not anecdote, real history, but it is very telling. We negotiated the Uruguay round. It took us 7 years, 7.5 years, actually, so a very long time. And after we closed the deal, and after we got to Marrakesh, and signed everything. 49 members. I'm not sure if all of them were contracting parties of the old system, but 49 countries, many of them in the system, cry hell, saying, hey, we cannot accept what has been negotiated. So Sofo said, what are you talking about? It has been closed, it has been signed, it has been gone through the ceremony, but they were not party to it. They were not present. They didn't have a delegation. So giving assistance on that, I know of a beautiful agency that was created in Geneva, I think after we finished. The name, I can remember the name in English, I remember the name in French, but it's ACICI, A-C-I-C-I. You can find it in Google. It's a beautiful agency created by the Swiss, but later became a multilateral agency. So it's now a multilateral agency with 40 members or 50 members in it. And it's an agency that provides technical assistance, WTO intelligence assistance to the small countries. So they tell them what's going on. They tell them, hey, the meeting at the end of July is crucial. You better go and vote or whatever, or oppose or whatever. So it gives advice on that. So it's an example. And the example you give now is another example. And I think we have to make every effort to level the playing field in that regard. Because, I don't know, Rufus, you know better than I, how big is the USTR presence in Geneva, and how much it would be in the middle of a big negotiation. 300 people easily. I have 12 people plus a floating flotilla of people coming to support me in services and things. And it was one of the biggest developing country delegations. You compare that to a small developing country, or even a big developing country like Pakistan, they cannot have that. So these are issues that deserve attention, maybe some funds, some benefactor to create a fund to provide this kind of support to countries so they can go to Korea and do what you described. Because the Koreans probably created the institute, but without the funding to support. And if it's with the funding, that's great.
Very good, thank you. And I'm going to follow up with a question that's not related, but similar in a sense, and that is a question about smaller businesses, SMEs. The larger multinationals can often achieve outcomes that they're looking for through their trade negotiations at the WTO, and plurilateral, multilateral, and bilateral negotiations. What should the WTO be doing to help give a voice to SMEs so that they can better compete in the global economy, which of course would also probably have political benefits for the WTO by building broader base of support for the WTO?
Well, you asked me a previous question that I forgot to answer because it was two questions and I went on with the first one and I forgot the second, which was, what do I learn from the NAFTA 2, from the USMCA that we just negotiated? I was the chief negotiator. And thank you for asking this question and for forgiving me my not answering the first one, because SMEs is a very good central element of a good answer to that. In the new NAFTA agreement, we developed a whole chapter on SMEs. So it's a chapter on creating space to support SMEs. So to do lots of measures that in the absence of this space, of this legitimation in the agreement, could be borderline, could be challenged. But now these are enshrined and they are perfectly fine. So you can create measures, for example, to use the government good offices through some agency or the ministry responsible, whatever, for example, to give scale to SMEs in a certain sector so they can get a credit on better terms than each one would be able to get it. So you can consolidate, syndicate the credit, passing part of the risk to the country level through the agency above, okay, a credit. Or you can facilitate to them organizing, I don't know, distribution or acquisition, procurement, or creating a brand. So all these forms of helping the SME compensate for the disadvantage that they do have. Nobody's fault, but it's just the fact of the fact of the real world, the modern world, that trade is increasingly global. Globality gives you scale. So a company from Singapore can be selling to Argentina, and a company from the United States is selling all over the world. And all that makes it efficient. The consumer benefit. Need to give more of a chance to SMEs to be able to compete. And in the USMCA, we have such a chapter. We have to see it work. We created a space. Maybe consider something similar that will be very popular in WTO, and I think quite appropriate.
So we're running out of time. I have a question. The question's posed as if it's from a friend. It's Ricardo Melendo Ortiz. And he says, Jesus, it's great to see you. So I'm hoping that's an old friend. He's asking a broader question, and maybe a good one to close on. You've talked about reinvigorating the negotiating function at the WTO. You've talked about the special and differential treatment. You've talked about how to bring together, bring some of the plurilateral experiences into the WTO. Do you see a chance to have a deep review of the WTO, a real reform agenda that might take several years? Now, I'm reminded, Rufus will be able to tell me if this is a true story or apocryphal, that Senator Howard Metzenbaum said, I don't understand why we're spending so much time negotiating with this country, Uruguay, such a small country. Why is it taking so long? But I don't know if that's a true story or not. Rufus probably might remember. But the question is, is that something that you would want to try to do as Director General, to have a new round and to look at some of these reform issues, including some of the difficult issues like we're having with the appellate body, but also some of the things about S&D and others. And let's close on that question, maybe make that a chance for you to wrap up your statement.
Well, let me give you two answers. The first one is that such a comment about negotiating with Uruguay is not entirely devoid of content, because the Uruguay round happened in good measure thanks to the tremendous energy and the capacity to appeal people, to bring people together, of then probably Foreign Secretary of Uruguay, Enrique Iglesias, who went from that to head the IDB for a long time. A great man, Enrique Iglesias, my good old friend. So the Uruguay round was his baby, and a good creation that he left to the world. No, I definitely do believe that the WTO needs to reconsider what is appropriate, develop a vision. And the vision has to really bring together the best minds available, the official vision of the parties. So it's something that has to be developed and shared. So one has to devote time to that. One has to put some time into having, there have been expert groups in the past, but they have been basically ornamental. I really believe that it is very important to have this kind of reflection as a mainstream purpose of the World Trade Organization. The Director General has to have a broad enough view and a long enough view to contribute, to lead in that regard, and also to avail himself of the best ideas of the members and of experts. I don't see that as something that you do in a retreat, that there's a retreat. The last week of 2024, everybody goes to Davos and thinks what to make of WTO. It's not the way to do it. But as one activity on the side in the WTO, I think it is important to reflect on the direction and the far vision of the WTO, and not only
Well, thank you, Ambassador Seade. Rufus, Wendy, any final words?
No, merely to thank Jesus for his very thoughtful presentation and wish him the very best.
Same here.
And Ambassador, thank you for your time. We're very grateful to you. I also would be negligent if I didn't mention many of the WITA members are very happy and pleased that we were able to conclude the trilateral agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And I know there's a great appreciation for your role in helping bring that. I know it's called TMEC in Mexico, USMCA here, but thank you for your leadership in helping bring that to close and the amazing team that you brought to that negotiation. We are all very grateful here that we were able to get a new and updated agreement. So thank you for your great work on that. Best of luck with your candidacy for the WTO, and we look forward to hosting you again at WITA.
Thank you. Let me make a comment on the USMCA.
Yes, thank you.
Despite all the things that have been said and discussed, I think it is remarkable that in the 3 countries, the final deal was approved by massive majorities in each chamber where it was considered, in the United States, in Congress, and in Senate. And if you look at each party individually, the Democrats in Congress, the Democrats in Senate, the Republicans in Congress, the Republicans in Senate. In Canada, it was actually unanimous, despite a very acrimonious politics in Canada. Canada is not a one-party system by no standards, by no means now. And nevertheless, also in Mexico, we've had many initiatives of the government bounced back by Congress, rejected or reformed. This one was approved by unanimity -1. So in all 3 countries, and that speaks of a political consensus, if not a social consensus, behind the deal. So I really hope that will be a harbinger of a stable, more successful, peaceful trade regime for North America. It has the political support.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We're very grateful to you. Thank you to everybody who stayed with us and is on watching this webinar. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Rufus. And Ambassador Seade, best of luck with your future and your candidacy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye, Rufus, Wendy. Bye-bye, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you.